All right, I'd like to call this meeting to order. Madam Clerk, can you please call the roll?
Yes, Mr. Chair. Mr. Weddleton.
Here. Here. Sorry.
Ms. Zalatel.
Here.
Mr. Dunbar. Mr. Dunbar has to be excused. Is that correct, Mr. Chair?
Correct.
Ms. Kennedy.
Here.
Mr. Rivera.
Present.
Ms. LaFrance.
Here.
Mr. Peterson.
Present.
Mr. Constant.
Here.
Ms. Quinn Davidson.
Here.
Mr. Perez Verdilla.
Here.
Mr. Dyson.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. Ms. Wint Pearson, can you please lead us in the pledge?
Certainly.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. All right, so we just have one item on our agenda today under old business. Item 4A, resolution number AR 2019-357, a resolution of the Anchorage Municipal Assembly denying a marijuana license and conditional use permit with variance to encroach within a required 200-foot separation buffer to a nearby protected land use, Hope Church for Alaska Sense LLC, a marijuana retail sales establishment with license number M10254, doing business as Alaska Sense LLC, and located at 217 East 4th Avenue, Suite D. Before we get started, the matter we are about to consider is an application for a marijuana retail sales establishment submitted by Alaska Sense. It is a quasi-judicial matter, and the municipal attorney has some instructions for us. Ms. Wint Pearson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I reviewed last time we met, there are some specific procedural requirements that come into play when this body sits in your quasi-judicial capacity, and I just wanted to remind you of those again tonight on the record. Pursuant to AMC 360-065, ex parte contact between members of the Assembly and the licensee, members of the public, including but not limited to constituents and the press, is prohibited for the duration of these proceedings. Pursuant to Title III, decisions issued by the Assembly in a quasi-judicial proceeding are subject to reconsideration for 15 days after the date of the decision, and this prohibition stays in place for the pendency of that period as well. Assembly members should not seek to visit the licensee's business for the purpose of gathering independent information relevant to this proceeding. That prohibition is also subject to that 15-day post-decision limitation. The AMC 360-065 does specify that the restriction on ex parte contact shall not be deemed to prevent those charged with conducting quasi-judicial proceedings from discussing matters related to the appeal amongst themselves. As we've discussed, any conversations among Assembly members are still governed by Open Meetings Act restrictions, but subject to those restrictions, you are permitted to discuss this application during its pendency. Pursuant to the Municipal Code of Ethics, Assembly members have a standing obligation not to participate in any official action in which the Assembly member or a member of their immediate family has a substantial financial or private interest. When considering a matter in your quasi-judicial capacity, you have an additional further prohibition from participating if you or a member of your immediate family have a measurable financial interest in any property affected by the application, or if you or a member of your family could foreseeably profit in any material way through resolution of the matters. If you believe you have any conflict which meets that standard, you should disclose that prior to proceeding to consider the application tonight for a determination from the chair or from the body about whether or not you should continue to participate. The public hearing in this matter is closed, which I understand the chair will continue to discuss with you, and from there I'll turn it back over to the chair to talk about the procedural history and what is before you tonight.
Thank you. So I want to review what has occurred to date and possible actions before us tonight. We held a public hearing on AR 2018-357 on October 8th, 2019 that was carried over to October 22nd and then closed. The applicant and a party claiming protected use status at that time made their arguments and presentation of evidence. At the close of the public hearing and parties' presentations, on the advice of council, the Assembly agreed to postpone deliberation and action and apply for a use classification request from the Planning Department for the site that claimed a protected use as a church. The Planning Director issued that on December 3rd, and it was distributed. We held a work session on December 6th. Tonight, we are here to take action by motions and deliberate. The public hearing is complete. Our municipal attorney has guidance for tonight's proceedings and the possible paths forward. Ms. Wint-Pearson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So as we discussed briefly during the work session on this matter, the initial decision that this body has before you tonight is whether or not to proceed to make a decision on the merits of this application or not. As we've discussed, there is a final decision from the Planning Director, a use determination regarding the property which previously had claimed to be a protected use. But there is still an appeal period pending for that decision. So as we discussed, you are free to move ahead in reliance on that decision and make a determination on the merits regarding the license and conditional use permit applications before you. But you can, as an initial matter, if you'd like to, make a motion to continue this matter until after the appeal period has run. That's one option. Another option for a motion is to continue this matter and simultaneously request council to file an appeal of that decision of the Planning Director. As we discussed, there are several parties that have standing to appeal that decision. This body is one of those parties because you requested the determination. The owner of the property at issue is another party who has standing. Other parties that have standing are those who have filed written comment in the process before the Planning Director. If no one makes a motion to do either of those two things, then the next step is for this body to move forward with consideration of the merits of the two applications in front of you. There are 3 documents before you as possible paths forward regarding the merits of those applications. The first is the original AR, I believe it's 2019-357, and that denied the conditional use based on a separation distance from a protected land use. That has been mooted by the decision made by the Planning Director and should not be moved as an option tonight. The other 2 documents in front of you are the 2 paths forward for tonight. The S version forgoes consideration of the conditional use permit and proposes to deny the marijuana license application on the grounds that the grant of the license would not be in the best interest of the public. The S1 version is drafted to approve both the license and the conditional use permit application. As with any other matter before this body, either AR can be modified by various floor amendments, findings, et cetera, that this body would like to include before they are finalized. With that, I'll take any questions on process and otherwise turn it over to the body to discuss.
Thank you. Mr. Constant, question on process?
Nope.
Ms. LaFrance, question on process? Okay, so 2 quick things before we move forward with a motion and deliberation. So first, Madam Vice Chair, I believe we have a procedural motion.
I move to accept 4 AIMs, Assembly Information Memorandums, as follows. AIM 138-2019, public comment regarding planning case 2019-0128. AIM 147-2019, additional documents regarding application, conditional use, variance, and public comments. AIM 167-2019 with the MOU. AIM 168-2019 with the updated staff report.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any discussion on that motion? Mr. Weddleton on the motion?
So I think you mentioned 2. I don't believe I have.
2 of them, I believe, were laid on the table items, so they're in your red folder.
No, I got those. The thing from Ryan Yalley and the one from the Memorandum of Understanding, but the first
Mr.
2.
Chair, if I might, I believe they're in the main packet.
Oh, they are.
Already previously submitted to us.
Oh, I see. Okay. Do you know what page, Chris?
Does someone know what page they're on in the packet? No.
So one of those items is starting on page 264. And the other item is, I promise, in your binder.
All right.
Any further discussion on the motion?
Thanks.
Thanks. Seeing no discussion, any opposition to the motion? And the clerk advises me the other item is on page 2, Mr. Weddleton. Okay, seeing no opposition then, that motion is approved. Second item before we get to motion and deliberation, are there any disclosures? Okay. Mr. Dyson.
Yeah, so just before we started here, I talked to a couple people out here who are here, and
Can you turn your mic on, please?
yeah, I think I did. Yeah, all right. Anyways, I talked to a couple people that are here that I've known for a long time, and I wonder if I contravened the restrictions on us as a quasi-judicial group here.
I would refer to Ms. Wint-Pearson, but I believe as long as you make the disclosure that you had discussions with members of the public, I presume, on this matter.
Yeah, but they're members of the public who got a dog in this fight.
Through the chair, what we've previously asked is that parties who've had ex parte contact inadvertently disclose to the full body both that they've had the contact and if there's any information you gleaned from that contact that is relevant to the deliberations, that you share that with the full body so that everyone is aware of it. And then the chair can make a ruling on whether or not, based on whatever substance there was to the discussion, whether there's possibly any kind of conflict of interest that arises out of it. But generally, we have cured these contacts through disclosure and disclosure of any information learned through the ex parte contact.
If I may. So I asked one of the principals if they were comfortable with the agreement and the memorandum of understanding, and I was told they were.
Okay, thank you. I guess if I must make a determination, then I determine that that is not a conflict, but thank you for disclosing that. Any other disclosures? Okay, seeing none, then we'll go ahead and move on to motion and deliberation. Mr. Constant?
Thank you. I would like to move to approve the S1 version.
Moved and seconded.
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment to the S1 version that is constant. Should be constant amendment 1, but it says constant amendment 2. And the amendment would add the subjects of, or kind of the items that were included in the MOU between the parties that state that the licensee and his or her agents, employees shall conform with the following terms: that extra staff between noon and 1:30 daily, except Saturdays, Sundays, or when the establishment is closed to the public. Extra staff means at least one more than is usually on duty. The second item would be a regular daily loitering check on days that the establishment is open to the public at regular intervals. The next item would be that they shall be closed from 11 to 2 o'clock on Sundays, or at times as may be amended in the MOU. And then also install lighting and security cameras around the exterior of the building with emphasis on visibility in the back of the facility to monitor activity in the alley. Positioning of light, illumination, security cameras shall conform to the MOU, and then no on-site consumption by inhalation endorsement shall be permitted for this location.
Second.
Thank you. Ms. Quinn-Davidson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just sort of a process question. So the S1 version that you're looking to amend, do we have that in front of us, or did we have it last week? I'm having a hard time finding all.
It is near the end of the packet, though. Both of the versions.
When you say the packet, which packet are you referring to?
The one that's in front of us. I don't know if you
I brought
have
these
one.
documents with me, but I wasn't given a packet. No, don't have that. So it could be this that I received at the last public meeting? Oh, thank you. This will help me follow along. Okay. Great. So you moved the S1 version and then shared Amendment 2, or moved Amendment 2 as well.
Which is my Amendment 1. It just has number 2 on it.
Okay,
But
thank you, Mr.
the
Johnson.
intent of the amendment is to incorporate the terms of the MOU as agreed to by the parties over the weekend, and it just makes sure in the licensing process that the parties' positions are made firm in the license.
Thank you. Mr. Whittleton.
I had a comment and a question. So this is 2A, this is to the AR. It says page 2 beginning at line 6, and that's like in the middle of the paragraph. Do you mean at the end of like line 9?
What page in your packet is your version of the?
Well, I'm just going the one that was in our red folder.
But the S1 version?
It says S1, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm not sure Mr. Gates can help us because he helped to draft this language for where it goes exactly.
I guess, but it's after this 2. You would just add it
Yes.
at the end.
Yes.
Okay, a comment on it. And these are out of the MOU. We have an operator who I have little confidence will follow through on many things. I think by witnessing their other operation, there's been a steady record of not operating well. So now we have what I think are nice things. They're awesome, really. But really scarce trust that these would happen. So if they're just not done, is there any sanctions, or just that's the way it goes?
Mr. Chair?
And this is in regards to the amendment?
Yeah, because it says here's a variety of things that the applicant will do should this license be approved. And they look good, but I don't trust that they would be done, and I don't see any sanctions if they're not. So it's
Sure. So I guess that's a question
that's
to
a
Mr.
question to
Constable.
the sponsor.
Sure. Go ahead.
To Chris.
I would answer back with another question that we'll come to in the next part of this deliberation, and that would be to search closely at the retail operation of previous licenses and find that list of credible violations you're talking about. I don't think you will. And so the violations that have compounded on their cultivation operation. And so I think it doesn't actually bridge the gap to ask the question, how would they do it in this case? Because it's a different question. It's a different set of circumstances and problems. And so to your question of what are the enforcement tools, I believe that this just adds, if they are not in fact doing these things, that it goes to the same place we have been having enforcement activities before, which is code enforcement. And while they aren't very happy with having to spend so much time with this operator, again, I would point back to the retail operation of this operator and ask, where are those violations?
Can I follow up on that? Is there, or maybe Dean could say, so we say code enforcement, but on other things like odor and so on, it's clearly this, if you have odor, then this, and here's the fine. But here we have things, why would code enforcement even be involved? They could say, oh, they're not doing it, there's no fine. They wave their finger at them, or is it maybe it's someone who knows these
Mr. Gates, you're already in the queue, so do you want to respond?
We're looking at each other. Through the chair, if I might, my advice on this would be that if you incorporate these as license conditions, then there's something that will come back before you in the license renewal process annually, and so failure to comply with the terms of the license could be grounds for not renewing the license when it comes back before you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Gates, did you want to add anything else?
Yes, I would. So one reason that these terms and conditions of the MOU are being added here to the resolution and to Section 2 regarding license conditions is that provides some enforcement mechanism. The MOU by itself doesn't have a lot of teeth to it. Adding it here to the resolution as an express condition on the license, it will allow, I guess, code enforcement to enforce them as violations of conditions attached to this license under Chapter 1080 of our municipal code, and we have our Article 8, our enforcement and civil penalties provisions. those would be applicable to enforcing these conditions that are being added by this amendment. You also have on the annual renewal process provisions that say you can deny a license for violating conditions attached to the license. So these conditions, if they're added, if they're approved to be added, they could be grounds for not renewing the license each year when it comes up for renewal. And I think that those maybe are the type of enforcement actions you were asking about, Mr. Weddleton.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything further, Ms. Wint-Pearson?
No, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Mr. Rivera?
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. So, question from me to staff. There are several parts of this amendment that talk about, or at times as may be amended in the MOU, which leads me to believe that these conditions, while we may be stating them here, are subject to change dependent on the MOU. Is that a practice that has been used in a prior conditions in the past?
Through the chair, no.
And a quick follow-up, are there any concerns about the framing of that?
Through the chair, so the MOU, the municipality is not party to that agreement, so any changes to the MOU, the applicant, the community council, and everybody involved are free to change it. If you make it a condition of the license, perhaps the clerk can speak to modifying anything with the license.
So
Mr. Chair.
Hold on. So I'll interpret that as you don't have any particular concerns. Did you want to respond to anything further, Ms. Honest?
Mr. Gates is in the queue, and he actually added that language. That wasn't my language.
Okay. Then after Ms. Honest, we can go to Mr. Gates.
Through the chair, we kind of mirror the same. If it's added as a condition to the license, that's what it would be. If there were any changes to the MOU between the parties, if it was to be added to the license, it would have to be done through a formal process where the assembly actually adds it.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rivera.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. Mr. Constant?
I would ask to be heard after Mr. Gates.
Sure. Mr. Gates?
Thank you. Yes, as the drafter of this language, I wanted to provide some perspective of my intent in including those that phrase that says the MOU as may be amended. It's in a few places here. I inserted this language because the MOU is a mutual agreement between three parties, and the intent was if those three parties agreed to modify their MOU for those terms where that language is placed to something a little different, that would be okay. That would still be an applicable condition to the license. And my thinking here, or my intent, is, for example, in little a, it says extra stuff between noon to 1:30 daily. But suppose that after 6 months they find that doesn't really work very well, and the three parties agree to change it to 11 to 2 daily, or they change it to 12:30 to 1 daily, or something like that. You know, this is a very narrow time frame, and maybe they will decide between the three of them, not one of them, that they mutually agree to amend the MOU, and I believe the MOU does require the three parties to agree to an amendment to change that time frame, as well as some other term. This language is only intended to accommodate their ability to do that.
Thank you. Mr. Constant?
Thank you. Two things to that. It might be that we want to add a subject that, or a phrase that is, but not less than these times, right? So to make it so that they can make agreements, but they're not less restrictive than these elements, which might satisfy some concern so that it doesn't, we don't have to be involved in the conversation. It just shall never be less than this. That's one theory of we could approach it to. But I actually was in the queue to respond slightly back to Mr. Weddleton's earlier question and just offer that there are amendments before us right now, one in particular that addresses creating a shorter term between licensing. And so not only do we have code enforcement as a vehicle for addressing any failures of these licensees, but we can change the terms of the license in terms of the times how it has to come back for us for review. And so it's not just limited to hoping that code enforcement can achieve some goal, but we also have the power of the license.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Wynn-Pearson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to comment on the question of incorporating terms or cross-references to the MOU in the actual license approval. My recollection is when we've considered this before, our primary concern has been making sure that we're not deferring the Assembly's licensing power to a third party and saying essentially you can do whatever the Community Council says you're allowed to do in the MOU or something like that. I think here this language does not step afoul of that line because it effectively just allows that that the parties can, by mutual consent, change these terms, and that concern that somehow we would place the licensee in the position of needing to only please the Community Council in order to retain a license granted by this body isn't completely created here. I think if you had any concern about it, you could remove the as may be amended references and just specify your terms and have the applicant come back to the Assembly if those needed to be amended. But as drafted, I don't think it's problematic in terms of running afoul of that concern that usually is the one that overlays these discussions about making sure that you aren't allowing the Community Council to effectively step into this body's legal role of granting or denying a license.
Thank you. Ms. Alatel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, I'd like to make an amendment and add a subsection F to this amendment saying any amendments to the MOU must be submitted by the licensee to the clerk's office within 5 business days of the execution of the MOU amendments, or something along those lines. Someone could probably wordsmith that better, but I'll read it one more time. Any amendments to the MOU must be submitted by the licensee to the clerk's office within 5 business days. Actually, let's just put a period after days. Within 5 business days, period.
Thank you. Is there a second?
I'll second that.
Do you want to speak to it?
I will briefly. The idea there is we will know what's going on. I'm a little bit afraid of allowing the Community Council and the parties to go forward, make amendments to the MOU, and us getting cut out of the loop in some form or fashion, or code enforcement getting cut out of the loop in some form or fashion. So this just places the onus on them to go through a formal process if they're amending the MOU as well. It's done in writing, it's clean, and it's submitted back to the clerk's office. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Weddleton on the amendment to the amendment.
Okay, but I want to get back to the big amendment at some point. Well, it sounds okay, but do we have a real clear, MOU between applicant, Downtown Community Council, and a third party? And we refer to an MOU. Is it crystal clear what we mean here? Someone, I guess Chris or someone, but I read this and I go, who's this an MOU between?
Sure, so Mr. Weddleton, part of the motion that the Vice Chair made was to add the MOU as an item to this, so it is in the record. So when you refer to the MOU, it is part of the record of this document.
I appreciate that, but people may not refer to that. But if you look at the plain language, it's easier. And so who would say between the applicant, Downtown Community Council, and a third party? Any third party? I mean, what happens 5 years down the road, this is still on there, and we go, who's the third party?
Yep.
But it's not called out. The Hope Center is not called out. Could I maybe ask Mr. Constant?
Yeah,
sure.
If I might, I would offer that I think it's best to vote this down and then make an amendment that strikes that whole phrase about the MOU and cleans it up so that it's just the terms before us. And if the parties change their mind, bring it back to your committee, bring it back through the process, and we can do it then. I think that the core question that Ms. Wynn-Pearson spoke about is that we don't want to get in the position where we're delegating this authority outside of us. And so I think really the cleanest action will be to just trim out the section. So vote this down, not add it. Then on those 3 items, it's, I guess it's just 2 items. On items C and D, delete, or at times as may be amended by the MOU or as may be amended.
And B. Well, I've got
Okay,
ready
that's
that
section-
speaks to that.
I think that's just the cleanest, simplest thing we can do. Let's eliminate all question about who is what, where, when, and how, and the power remains right at this dais.
Thank you. So, Ms. Salatel and Mr. Weddleton, are you agreeable to rescinding your amendment to the amendment?
Sure.
I'd actually leave it. And for one, even if we did what Mr. Constant and these red lines I drew do, it doesn't hurt. However, as that next amendment, we could also, should that pass, delete F. But I think, should that amendment fail, we do want that F in there.
Okay. And I would
Ms.
say
Salatel's amendment.
either way is fine.
I just want to make sure that in her amendment where it says, amendment to the MOU, it's crystal clear what we're talking about.
Got it. So,
That would be fine.
okay, so then we still have this amendment before us.
Can we amend the amendment to say the MOU and AIM?
We cannot do that, no.
We can't.
Right, because it's a third order?
That would be the third.
Oh, you can't really
Yeah.
do that, really?
That would
Oh,
be
it's
the
just
third.
getting fun.
Okay, so the clerk advises me that both the mover and the second have to agree to rescind an amendment. Otherwise, the amendment is still on the floor. So, because the second does not agree, the amendment is still on the floor. I don't see any further discussion on the amendment to the amendment, so members may proceed to vote.
Oh, I got you. Good day, yeah, good. Okay, so that.
So that amendment passes 6-4.
So, Mr. Chair, if I might,
Yes,
I
Mr.
would
Constant.
move an amendment that would strike, let me see your page. I don't have a numbered version, but on section B, where it says, "and of all places described in the MOU as may be amended," on line section C there, "or at times as may be amended in the MOU," section D, "shall conform to the MOU as may be amended," and then section F, all.
Second. I think, wait, can you repeat what you do on D?
Yeah, and D, it's ends at cameras, and shall conform to the MOU as may be amended will be gone.
Okay, so to,
Yeah, I'm sorry, that would create a ungrammatical sentence, or it would say position of light, illumination, and security cameras, period.
Okay, shall conform to the MOU. So then just strike as may be amended.
Can you just strike that whole last sentence?
Sure.
From positioning all the way to amended. Okay, I'd second that, thank you. And you strike F, the new F?
Yeah.
Okay.
Mr. Constant, can you repeat it one more time, please?
Which, all of it?
Yes.
So it would be section B, deleting "and of all places described in the MOU as may be amended." Section C, after Sundays, period. So it would delete "or at times as may be amended." Section D, it should be the whole sentence, "positioning of lighting, illumination, and security cameras shall conform," etc. And then section F.
Okay, moved and seconded. Mr. Weddleton, do you want to speak to this amendment to the amendment?
I would. I support this, and Ms. Wynn Pearson kind of gives me confidence it's not going to be really bad. But we recently had an issue where we relied on the Soil Conservation Service District to do something with large animal things, and this has been in our code for a while, and we learned a lesson. It's kind of an outside source we have no control of, and when they quit operating, we didn't know, and things became messy, and we scrambled to fix it. I think we should be real hesitant in our code to rely on someone outside of our little family here. So,
Thank you. Ms. Quinn Davidson on the amendment to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can I get a little more information from the mover on why we're removing F and how that sort of jives with the rest of it?
Sure, Mr. Chair, if I might. F was added to, in case all the other sections didn't get deleted, it would ensure that there was a clear understanding of the position of the MOU in the context of the overall resolution. But I believe that the smartest thing we can do is not rely on a third party, which Mr. Weddleton just described. And so it just cleans all that section out.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for letting me follow up. So the intent is just to remove any reference to the MOU and just impose certain restrictions that are static without taking into account what happens in any future MOUs or current.
Yeah, if I might, it's not, we're leaving one reference or two to the MOU, but any reference to the MOU as may be amended, right? Because we're only going to go off of the MOU that was submitted to us. Any future amendments to that can come before us.
I see. Okay.
Thank you. Seeing no further discussion, members may proceed to vote on the amendment to the amendment.
I see a question.
That amendment passes 9-1. We now have the amendment to the amendment. We now have the amendment before us. Any further discussion on the amendment? Seeing none, members may proceed to vote on the amendment. That amendment passes 9-1. Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to move amendment number 1 to the S1 version.
Is there a second? Okay, thank you. Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this amendment places conditions on the marijuana retail establishment license to assure operation in accordance with municipal code. And given the history of violations, which Mr. Weddleton pointed out, and I understand that different in nature on the retail side from the cultivation facility, but there have been consistent violations nonetheless. So item 3, and there's a typo there, it says 2019, should be 2020. That would be a subsequent amendment to the amendment I'll address shortly. The intent there is to provide a quarterly review. And then item 4, licensee shall comply with all terms and conditions, and if 3 or more documented violations occur, then the clerk's office is authorized to summarily suspend the license under AMC section 10.80.825. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Constant.
Thank you. So in spirit, I think I'm fine with number 3, but I think that the way it will actually work in the real world is not going to do what you intend it to do. It doesn't speak to a quarterly review, it speaks to after the first quarter, but I don't know that they'll even have their doors open at the first quarter. And so I'm wondering if we might consider amending it to be 90 days after they receive their certificate of occupancy, which is the day when they would essentially be legally allowed to open the door. At least I think that's what that is. If we might hear from the applicant, because I don't think it's unreasonable to request a quarterly review, but I just don't know that they're going to have their doors open. Can we hear from the applicant?
Sure.
The one question I was going to say, Jana Waldstein, for the record, attorney for the applicant, conditional certificate of occupancy would probably be the better term, because she could get open with a conditional certificate of occupancy, and then a regular final CO can happen a long time after, and so I think that would nullify the effect of Assemblywoman LaFrance. We anticipate Smarty getting open early summer, June, and so to completely frank, probably not a chance in heck that we're going to be back here in March open and operating.
And so that's one suggestion that I would have to make an amendment to this. I'm not ready to make that because I want to go to the second point as well, which we might want to divide these questions because I don't know if you'll be amenable to the second amendment, but the first one I think is pretty reasonable just because reality has a timeline to it. And that is that I would like to consider taking the number 4 and making it related to this license, right? Because the challenge that they are having with their odor violations, almost all, or not almost all, many of the licensees who are in their cultivation operations continue to struggle with this, and they're making a process of refining and refining and refining. And so I think that it would be reasonable for us to contemplate tightening this only so that it's not any one of the licenses, but just this license once it's operating. And I think that then it becomes very reasonable and at the same time has the teeth that you want. I think it could even be fewer than 3 if it's this license, because we're seeing that the retail licensees just aren't getting the violations because they're easier to manage.
Thank you. So I think unless the mover states otherwise, it might make more sense for us to procedurally do those as separate amendments. So did you want to move the first one?
Yes, I would like to, and I'm not sure exactly how to word in section number 3 there, change the language to be the retail establishment license shall expire at 11:59 p.m., 90 days after receipt of their conditional certificate of occupancy. Absent Yeah, that's an interesting dilemma, but I still, rather than not allow this to move forward, Mr. Peterson makes the point that their new license application will be due in August, and so in some ways, if they open in June, it's a moot question because they'll naturally be back before us. But I understand the protection you're trying to build, and so I think it's still reasonable to apply the question of 90 days after. Maybe we say unless we've entered a new license period. Sorry about being abstract, Madam Clerk.
You need him to state it one more time.
I need to know if he wants it in both places. Does he want it in both places or just in one place? Both places, where it says,
Yes, in both places. The timeline, the calendar date specific is not very functional in the context of the intent. It should be based on a triggering event, and the triggering event is the receipt of the conditional use, the conditional certificate of occupancy.
Okay. And then is there a second to that amendment to the amendment?
I'll second. Oh.
Okay, seconded. I'm just going to go down the queue, and if folks want to speak to the amendment, let me know. Otherwise, I'll keep you in. So, Ms. Salatel.
Yes, I'll speak to the amendment to the amendment. I am not a fan of this amendment for a couple of reasons. One, the license will be up in August to apply for renewal. Two, I don't think we've done this to any other license, even those who come back for renewal that have had repeat violations. There is an opportunity to learn about violations through the CEDC. We get the reports from code enforcement. So just to have the license expire on a date set forward, I'm uncomfortable with, because we've had others in similar situations and we didn't set a different expiration date. So I have some concerns about that, and in all likelihood, it's going to be moot because the renewal application is going to be due before any time period we put forward here, or they won't be operating. So I would suggest not amending the amendment or even passing the underlying amendment.
Thank you. Ms. Quinn-Davidson on the amendment to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think it makes sense, but I'm interested in what Ms. Salatel brought up and wondering if Ms. Pearson could speak to sort of any sort of due process or other concerns if we're not applying that equally with licensees.
Through the chair, yeah, I wanted to be in the queue for both to comment both on this and then on the other proposed amendment, if I might, while I have a moment. This language I pulled from a previous license approval. I think it was the 2018 cultivation license for this same operator, but it was something, this is indeed something, it's exactly word for word from something that this body did almost 2 years ago. But it is
But I do agree that the timing is very challenging here, and Ms. LaFrance and I didn't have a long time to talk about this amendment, and so I agree that the March date is somewhat challenging because likely you won't have an open operator, and if you get any further out from that, you are already in the middle of the renewal process, which usually starts pursuant to code in May when the applicants are notified of the need to renew. So it is also something you could attempt to somehow rephrase it, or you could also flag this for this August when this comes back for renewal. It's certainly something that you could impose then if the first 3 months of operation of this operator's business have not gone as you would like to have them go. You could then in August impose a shorter expiration period and require a return to the assembly for a review of whether or not the license terms and conditions have been met. Oh, and if I might, one additional thing to Mr. Constant's second point about the violations in point 4 being limited to this license. They already are, by the way this is drafted. If you look at the second page where it says violations within 6 months of operation pursuant to this approval. So as drafted, this amendment is limited to only the operations of the licensee pursuant to this specific license and not their other licenses in the municipality.
Thank you.
Thank you. For the members procedurally, I'm just going to leave you in the queue and assume that you want to speak to the amendment when we actually get there. So if you don't, please take yourself out. So Mr. Weddleton on the amendment to the amendment.
Oh, well, I guess I won't support it, but I think for many of the reasons Ms. Zolotel said. And then I think in the case with, if we could ask Mandy a question. So, I mean, if we do this, I guess we just suspend it. Because, I mean, for general license renewals, we have notification periods to the community councils and so on, but this is just saying we're going to suspend it. So are there any other pieces of the process that would be connected with this that would be hard to meet given that time frame? Tough question. That's a tough question because I was thinking it up as I spoke, and now you're going to try to answer it the same way. Okay, well, that's fine. This is new territory, so thanks. Makes me nervous. So I'm not supportive of amended or unamended number 3. So,
thank you. Before we vote, right? On the amendment to the amendment or the amendment? Okay. Mr. Peterson on the amendment to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Are we in the process of eliminating the March dates in this amendment completely? Is that what this does?
Correct. It won't be date specific.
Okay. All right. That was the question I had. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Dyson on the amendment to the amendment.
Yeah, I'm encouraged by our process here, and I appreciate what we're trying to do. I would stretch this first part a few months more because of the startup of a new business, and I would put in the code 2 more, or at least 2 more iterations of the same thing, so that it wouldn't be just being really good for 90 days and then that's back to an annual thing. So that's a suggestion.
Thank you. Ms. Kennedy on the amendment to the amendment.
Thank you. I'm terribly bewildered here, but on the date itself, the March 10th, 2019, or March 1st, 2019, is that supposed to be 2020?
So the amendment to the amendment is not date specific.
Right, but if that doesn't pass, then we're stuck with...
Sure. So the intent is, as I think the Vice Chair stated, 2020. Yeah.
Okay, so we're not, okay. All right, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Constant, on the amendment to the amendment.
Thank you. So the licensing staff, the clerk's office mentioned that the amendment itself is flawed because it shouldn't be the conditional certificate of occupancy. It should be actually on the date the license is issued. 90 days after the date the license is issued would be the most logical position according to them, because then they actually have kind of control. It's in their hands. It's the day they're granted the right to open the doors. Even with the CCO, you still have to get licensed, and there could be a time frame between those two. And so I have been persuaded by both Mr. Weddleton and Ms. Zalatel that because of the deadline of the license, that this amendment and the underlying amendment in this section number 3 isn't really at this time essential. And what's essential is that we keep our eyes on the ball for this license as it is if it is issued, and then if it is reissued in August, because the timelines are incredibly constrained.
So did I understand that you are intending to change the amendment to conform with the clerk's advice?
If myself and the seconder could do that without an amendment, we would like to do that.
I think they could, right?
But ultimately,
Mr. Peterson, do you agree? Okay. Ms. LaFrance, on the amendment to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I may have a different question now, just based on what Mr. Constant said, because I was going to suggest that probably we don't need number 3, given that the licensee is not expected to be up and running until June, and then it comes before us in August. The intent, again, was to have a quarterly review so that we would keep on top and keep track of anything that would happen. So my sense is that probably at this time, we may not need that part, though I agree with Mr. Dyson that we will want to, when we come back to it in August, continue it regularly.
So if I might, Mr. Chair, change the motion one more time to delete section 3.
Sure. Ms. Honest?
I just wanted to remind the members that there is a provision in code for the renewal period, and it's close, so July 1st. So if they go past July 1st, they are not required to submit a renewal application for that period. There's kind of a grace period where they would be ushered into the next licensing period. So their license would be issued after July 1st for the following whole year. So it's a little close to the June anticipated date, and if it goes over, I just wanted you all to know that that's a possibility.
Sure. Ms. LaFrance?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So to Ms. Honest, that would mean we would not see this license in August. We would see it in, well, those here.
Following year's August, that's correct.
In 2021.
Right.
Okay, thank you. So I think I retract my previous comments. Sorry, Mr. Chair.
So, Mr. Constant, I think you were in the middle of changing the motion.
Yeah, I'm a little bit befuddled as well as how to act. I think if we might ask our attorneys if there would be a cleaner way to require that even if they open in July, they have to come back before us. And if that's the case, then I would still suggest we delete this language and then come back to it with another amendment shortly. Is that a reasonable approach?
Yeah, through the chair, if I might, I apologize. I requested to speak, but I think I'm now like number 35 in the queue. I think it may be cleaner if you were to simply delete item number 3 entirely and then propose a new condition, which perhaps, depending on what you want, you could simply propose a quarterly reporting requirement, require the licensee to come before the body every 3 months with a report on compliance with the terms of the approval and terms and conditions of municipal code and state law applicable to the establishment. Or you could do something that is potentially more punitive. You already do have kind of this this catch-all in number 4, where if there are documented violations, that's grounds for suspension. So perhaps what you're just looking for is a quarterly reporting requirement on compliance with the terms and conditions of the license.
Thank you. And I was just conferring with the clerk, and we actually do have that language for a license that we'll be seeing in the near future. So we could use that same language likely for this situation.
So if I might then, Mr. Chair, one last amendment or reframing of the amendment, and that would be to strike section 3.
Does the second agree? Okay. So I'm going to assume I don't need to go through this list of 35, and we're going to go ahead and vote on the amendment to the amendment. That passes 9-0. All right, so I'll go ahead, go back through the queue. We now have the amendment before us. Ms. Salatel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On number 4 in the amendment, where it says, if the licensee accrues 3 or more documented violations of municipal code within 6 months, are we talking about all the same violation, different violations, including self-reported violations? What are we talking about there? Because there are a lot of different types of violations, or just any violation. So I guess I'd like some clarity about that, because there are some where operators often self-report and then take care of it. So I just need from the sponsor of the amendment maybe to get a little bit more clarification.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, I would ask Ms. Wint-Pearson if she would comment on that. We didn't really, as she noted, have any time to discuss it, but the intent was to identify the more serious violations that could occur, and I'm not sure the best way to characterize those. So if Ms. Wint-Pearson would help, that would be great.
Certainly, through the chair. If it helps, the way I drafted this was intended to capture the scope of all types of violations because of the fact that the history that this body has had with this operator has involved examining an array of different types of violations of municipal code. It has included with their other licenses, there have been odor violations, also violations of inspection requirements, also been tax issues and certificate of occupancy requirement violations. So because the scope of the issues have not been limited to one area, I drafted this to incorporate all violations of municipal code. It's an interesting question of when does something become a violation, and I think that would probably be a case-by-case analysis because we have different triggers for each different type of violation. A tax bill, usually there's once it becomes delinquent, then it's recorded as something that it would be a violation. There is a notice of violation process for odor violations. So I think we'd have a slightly different trigger for each of these, but I would read this as drafted to incorporate all of those. And so if there were more than 3 of each of those types taken all together, then this provision would be triggered.
So we don't have anybody from code enforcement here, I don't think, unfortunately. So I'm going to kind of put planning on the spot, just because we go to the CEDC meetings where we do review the violations. Do you have any thoughts about just 3 violations generally versus being more specific about the types of violations, having sat through the quarterly reports from Mr. Fern?
Through the chair, unfortunately, that question's out of the purview of the planning department, so I can't really speak without any solid evidence or backing.
Chicken.
Thank you.
Smart.
If I might.
Mr. Peterson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In some instances, some of these violations are clerical in nature. Shipping manifest was mistaken. They get the wrong number of the plant. They have to seed the stem system where they follow every plant from the beginning to the end, and occasionally they may get a number wrong there. Those are not major violations, and so it's hard, unless you're going to list which violations count as major violations, how we're going to make a decision on which ones count and which ones don't count. I think it puts us in a challenging situation, especially since we're doing this on the fly. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to go back in the queue, and I think pretty much everyone's in the queue. Ms. Quinn Davidson?
I essentially had the same questions as Ms. Salatel.
Thank you. Mr. Weddleton?
Thanks. I can't support this. Excuse me, though, I mean, I'd like to hold this operator very, very accountable to all these things. But, this is to summarily suspend. It's pretty much the end game. And that's a big penalty for something that, as Ms. Peterson has said, could be 3 fairly minor things. We don't really know. So it's just a little too heavy. And, we have, we'll be starting to look very closely in January at the CEDC at some changes to the code. And one big thing is this: when do things rise to the level of suspending a license or putting tighter restrictions on it? And I think this is a very good starting point for part of that discussion, which would apply to all licenses, presumably, and see where we land. So we'll have more time to look at something like this. But I just think this is too vague on the violations, what exactly they are, with a really, big penalty, kind of the ultimate penalty.
Thank you. Mr. Dyson?
Yeah, I have more confidence in you all, and I think that you will easily be able to figure out what are the violations that significantly affect the public and the neighbors and so on. But I do agree with Mr. Weddleton that I want these the supervision of this operator to be very tight, and I'm fine with maybe the first couple of cycles to have a drop-dead date unless the Assembly acts in the affirmative. And I would hope that a couple of cycles through this with good behavior, that you all will start extending out the period and rewarding this operator for good behavior. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have someone on the phone?
Yes, this is Cameron Perez Radio.
Thank you. Welcome back. Ms. Wint-Pearson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to give a few comments on the procedural distinction between suspension and revocation and what those two things do. So summary suspension under 1080-825 basically is a power the clerk has anyway if the clerk determines that a person holding a license has acted and appears to be continuing to act in a way that constitutes an immediate threat to the public health, safety, or welfare. And so this is a provision that you all used previously in granting a license extension to just clarify that you believed repeated violations of by a single operator arose to the level of a suspension. If a summary suspension is issued, it isn't actually the end game. It simply requires the operator to immediately shut down. They get a notice. They have a hearing within 5 days. They can challenge the suspension, and then simultaneously what this provision says is the license revocation proceeding is then commenced. That also involves a hearing process and opportunity to present evidence, make arguments about whether or not you should be allowed to remain open. So, and also I would say those two processes are separate and distinct. So as you consider your options, you could potentially say the summary suspension is too immediate. What we'd like to do is just say that if we get to this level, we'd like to have the license revocation proceeding immediately commence, or vice versa. You could do one or the other. But I did just want to clarify that it isn't immediate game over. It's just the beginning of a process set by code. It's just that when you go with the summary suspension option, the operator remains closed for the pendency of that hearing process.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Salatel.
Thank you. To follow up on that, then the clerk is already authorized under 1080-825 to take action without us explicitly saying so. Did I hear that right?
Through the chair, yes. When the clerk in her discretion determines that the threshold in the code is met, what you are doing in this, if in this language, if you were to adopt it, is providing direction to the clerk that you believe that threshold is met for this operator if there are a certain number of violations within a set period of time.
So we'd be taking away the clerk's discretion that currently exists in code at present?
Through the chair, I think you would be simply directing the clerk on on how you interpret that. Again, this is something that was done previously with another operator where this was an issue.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so Mr. Weddleton.
Well, I appreciate that. That's helps me reconsider this quite a bit. So I'd like to offer an amendment to this one. So 3 is gone, 4 exists. So on number 4, on the second of our page is the third line. And so, Ms. Pearson, check my wording on this. So is authorized to begin the process to summarily suspend. Would that be proper? Is that what I think you recommended that. That's what I'm striving for.
Through the chair, I'm not sure that is actually a difference. The summary suspension is an immediate action by the clerk, and then following it, there's a hearing after the summary suspension is issued. So I think beginning the process and summarily suspending are effectively the same thing when it comes to that. What I was suggesting is that you could eliminate that section and just say that you request the municipal clerk to commence a license verification proceeding and not have the summary suspension option, or vice versa. You could use one or the other as your desired consequence here. But I think your edit doesn't actually lead to a different legal consequence.
No one second that then. Okay.
Thank you.
You can move on. Thanks.
All right. Mr. Constant.
Never mind.
Ms. Alatel.
I have an amendment. On number 4, the municipal clerk is authorized to bring the license to the assembly for consideration. Authorized to bring the license back to the assembly to consider. Gosh, I can't read my own handwriting. I apologize. I've redone this a few times. The municipal clerk is authorized to bring the license back before the assembly to take action, or to consider action. Sorry, I want to use the word consider action, because I think that gets to what we're trying to do.
So what specifically are you amending? All of 4?
After authorized, the municipal clerk is authorized to bring the license back to the assembly to consider action.
Second.
On the license. I guess it should probably say on the license. Sorry.
And then to delete the remainder of that?
That would be correct, yes.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Discussion on this new amendment to the amendment?
Very briefly, Mr. Chair. I mean, I think this does what we're looking to do, which is to review any violations. Apparently 3 is a threshold. What we'll have the opportunity to do, if it's noticed to us, depending on when we learn of it, it might have an opportunity to go through the CEDC, or CEDC may already be familiar with the violations, given the different reports that we get, and it'll also give us the opportunity to have kind of a full discussion about what those violations were, what happened, were they self-reported, but get to Ms. LaFrance's intent, which is that we're reviewing this and we're taking it up again when we do see a number of violations, but it also doesn't, because there are so many different types of violations, doesn't summarily shut down the operator. The clerk has some authority, and it doesn't usurp that authority either. It just lets it get back before us.
Thank you. Any other discussion on this amendment to the amendment? Seeing none, members may proceed to vote. Mr. Perez-Verdia, how do you vote? That passes 8-1. We now have the amendment before us. Ms. LaFrance. Okay. Ms. Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I'd like to support this, but my question in all of this, though, I guess it would just maybe be an assumption too, obviously, but because we haven't really specified what kind of violations that we're talking about, I'm just a little concerned that this might actually encourage, not support, not doing a lot of self-reporting on those, some of those violations. And even though we know that can happen anytime. I mean, obviously, people don't have to report if they choose not to, and then they could still get found out at some point. But I'm wondering if there's any benefit in maybe describing that violation as those that are non-self-reported violations, if that helps in any of this. I certainly don't want to encourage non-reporting, but at the same time, I can see where that could be a risk. So, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Constant.
So then, an amendment are we at a tertiary now, or are we just we're on the main amendment?
We're on the main.
Then I would make that amendment to add at the end, notwithstanding self-reported violations.
And I would second.
I don't know the exact legal language, but I just want to, I think it's wise because where would that go exactly? I don't even know the language before us right now. Maybe just at the end, a new sentence that say violations, self-reported violations not to be considered, shall not be considered. Okay, so here's the amendment. Thank you, Mandy. Save the day. If licensee accrues 3 or more non-self-reported documented violations. Non-self-reported would be after more.
Thank you. Is there a second? Moved and seconded. Did you want to speak to that? No. Okay. Mr. Dyson, on this new amendment to the amendment?
I'll wait.
Okay. Ms. Alatel, on this amendment to the amendment?
Thank you. I appreciate the intent of the amendment to the amendment, but you can self-report, as Mr. Weddleton over here puts it, some real whoppers.
Yep.
So they wouldn't count toward the 3 that would signal it back before the clerk's office. And you could have multiple self-reported violations in theory of the same thing over and over, meaning you're really not learning the lesson. So there is some concern there, and I don't know if that undercuts the intent of what Ms. LaFrance was trying to get at.
Thank you. Ms. Kennedy, on the amendment to the amendment.
Thank you. No, I can appreciate that concern there, but my thought is that we get the reports every other month or every 3 months in terms of the list of violations. So the CEDC has every 3 months, thank you. So we already have the ability to look at what's being reported, and if we see that they're self-reported but they're significant, then we can certainly start the process from that end as well. So I'm just thinking that in an effort to keep people from not self-reporting, that we might want to give them a little bit of a break on this, so to maybe encourage a little more honesty and not have people too worried about trying to protect themselves in this by just not reporting. Anyway, that's my motivation behind this one. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Constant.
Yeah, I just would add that in the other side of the coin, other than trying to keep people from doing bad things, it actually is promoting good behavior, which is the idea is incentive carrot for doing good. So I made a mistake here. Hands up in the air. We did it. And I think that's wise policy.
Ms. Quinn-Davidson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with the intent, but as Ms. Salatel said, I think to create a loophole where if you had a serious violation that you just immediately reported it and then we couldn't consider that is problematic. So I'll be voting against the amendment, even though I do understand the intent.
Mr. Constant.
I don't think it actually means we can't consider it. In fact, it doesn't do that at all. What it says is that the clerk isn't immediately notified to do this action. That what it doesn't do is trigger an automatic action. That's all. It doesn't take our ability to respond.
Thank you. Seeing no further discussion, members may proceed to vote on the amendment to the amendment. People are thinking. Mr. Perez-Verdia, how do you vote?
Tell him to press the mute button.
That amendment fails 5-4. We now have the main amendment before us. Any further discussion?
Yeah, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Dyson.
Yeah. I may have gotten lost here in the, so we deleted number 3?
Correct.
And so as it stands now, then there's, tell me what happens with deleted number 3.
I believe it is the intent of the Vice Chair to have another amendment after we're done with this to deal with the quarterly reporting issue. So we're going to deal with it after this.
All right, thank you. I appreciate the clarification.
Thank you. Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm wondering if someone could read to me number 4 so we sort of all know what we're actually really voting on. Thank you.
Through the chair, paragraph number 4 will read, licensees shall comply with all terms and conditions of municipal code and state law and regulation. If licensee accrues 3 or more documented violations of municipal code or state law or regulation within 6 months of operation pursuant to this approval or any extension thereof, the municipal clerk is authorized to bring the license back before the assembly to consider action on the license.
Thank you. Seeing no further discussion, members may proceed to vote. Mr. Perez-Verdia, how do you vote? That passes 7-2. Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move amendment number, I guess this would be 3. And it would replace section 3 that we deleted from the previous amendment to state that the following conditions shall be placed on license. The applicant shall appear before the assembly for the year of 2020 for a quarterly update of operations and verification of continued compliance with Anchorage Municipal Code. The municipal clerk will notify the application of the scheduled meeting dates for the appearances before the assembly. For the quarter, yeah, it says application here, but applicant, okay. For the quarterly updates, the municipal clerk shall provide information regarding State of Alaska notice of violations, land use enforcement notice of violations, and the rulings on any violations during that quarter.
Is there a second?
A second.
Can you read that one more time, please?
Do you want me to print it and pass it out to everybody?
Yeah, that'd be helpful.
Do you want me to read it?
No, she's going to print it. Did you want to speak to it?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I feel like we already got here on this one. So, I mean, this meets what I was trying to do with the previous version as far as ensuring that this license comes back before us.
Thank you. Mr. Whittleton on the amendment.
Sorry, I guess I'm reading it now. I'd support this. It's actually, we get quarterly reports at the CDC already. The applicant has been called out to do it. And I think we initiated that because of the applicant's other operations. So this is not really burdensome, but I think useful.
Thank you. Mr. Constant on the amendment.
Yeah, just a quick question about 1080-821. I'm having a hard time dialing into it on my phone. Does it reference the state law? The state practices?
I assume that's a question for the attorneys.
Yeah.
I apologize if you might clarify again, Mr. Chair, which provision you're asking if 1080, if the license renewal provisions or which portions
No,
of 1080?
This says license. I'm trying to understand where the state law fits into the violation review that we're making, the state code violations. So it might not be germane to this topic. It might be more germane to Mr. Weddleton's process at his committee next month. I'll remove my question for now.
Thank you. Ms. Alatel on the amendment.
Thank you. I guess I'm a little bit confused about why we need this amendment with everything we just did in the previous amendment, because it has quite a few opportunities to bring the license back before us. As we've talked about, a lot of these things already happen in the CEDC. Is there some concern that the CEDC isn't reporting out frequently enough to the entire body instead of bringing the applicant here to the assembly? I guess that's one of my questions. We do talk about notice of violations. I guess I haven't had any discussions in my participation with CEDC about land use enforcement notice of violations. So I guess what are we hoping to gain from requiring the applicant to appear before us quarterly?
Thank you. I think Ms. LaFrance is in the queue and will respond to that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Honestly, it's the first bullet point that I am most interested in, given that there's a possibility we may not see the license or it may not come for over a year back to the body. I mean, the quarterly updates, I think that the process is working fine with going to the committee. And it was my understanding that this was drafted based on the discussion we were having with the previous part of the amendment. So for me, it's the first bullet point that's most important.
Thank you. Mr. Peterson on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I was thinking about offering a friendly amendment that said that the first quarterly update will take place 90 days after the business opens. Because we're not sure when that is going to happen at this point in time. It's an unknown.
So is that a motion that you're making?
Yes, I'll make that motion.
Okay. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay. Moved and seconded. Do you have it? Okay. Mr. Constant, did you want to speak to this amendment to the amendment?
Yeah, so the amendment up there, does it have to be here in this room, or can it be to the committee by this language? Because the committee is the place that does the deep dives into these questions, and it seems like an extraordinary action to bring them up in front of this place at this time.
I think as written, it says before the assembly, so I would assume that means this body. Okay, so we currently have an amendment to the amendment before us. Seeing no further discussion, members may proceed to vote on the amendment to the amendment. That amendment to the amendment passes 9-0. We now have the main amendment before us. Mr. Constant?
I would just like to amend that section again to read an assembly committee. Yep, that we just amended.
The CED?
Yeah, I mean, really, it's the Community Economic Development Committee. Shall appear before the CEDC of the Assembly.
Is there a second?
Second.
Moved and seconded?
Yeah, where exactly?
Yes, would you please? Thank
Okay, we're going to go ahead and take 5 minutes. Upstairs if you're interested. So, Mr. Constant, do you want to state your amendment to the amendment?
You're asking me to remember something that was 1,000 years ago.
Yes.
Madam Clerk, did you write it down?
Well, through the chair, the Ms. LaFrance's amendment, which Ms. Honest, could you put back up there on the board? It's the quarterly condition. The motion disappeared, and so when you made your motion, Mr. Constant, I was looking for this, not yours.
Right.
So I'm sorry I didn't
No
get
problem.
it. You'll have to repeat it.
Mandy, Ms. Honest, do you have your little note page for me? Or would you mind inserting it and then I can read what you insert?
Yeah.
Okay, so it would be to insert before the Assembly, or it could be before, yeah, the Community and Economic Development Committee of the Assembly.
Looking for a second?
Is there a second?
I'd second that.
Okay. Do you want to speak to it?
Yeah, it just seems that this is not the place for thoughtful conversation about any kind of issues related to violations or other business. Instead, this is for deliberation on important items. And so I think it would be better if we want to get to the bottom of what's going on, that we do it in a committee, and then from the committee, that committee can report forward to the body and make action if necessary.
Thank you. Ms. Kennedy on the amendment to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I guess my question would be, just to verify, that this wouldn't have any, we wouldn't have any problem with bringing forward some other violations in that could occur before this time anyway. So it doesn't preclude us from acting on something else in the interim.
And if I might, Mr. Chair, the committee, when it gets its regular reports, has full latitude to make recommendations to the body. And so if there are actions and items that come forward before us at that place or any other time and place, it is within our purview to ask the licensee of any of these operations to come before us.
Thank you. Seeing no further discussion on the amendment to the amendment, members may proceed to vote. That passes 8-1. We now have the amendment before us. Any further discussion? Mr. Dyson.
Yeah, so I'm going to vote no because we have pulled the teeth
What was this 9-0?
and claws out of a very, very good direction we were going. And now we've gone from the original amendment from Ms. LaFrance that if
Or is this an amendment?
there was bad behavior, the license goes away unless the assembly acts positively. And now we've gone to the reverse of that, and it's on kind of an exception basis now. And so I disagree. And this situation we've had with this operator, I thought at first it was almost, no, I better shut up. It was just bad faith. And with what Ms. LaFrance put before us, it was clearly showing the sense of responsibility that I think we should do, and setting this one aside from many that we've dealt with where the offense was so egregious. So I'm sorry, personally, that we have gone down this trail and not stuck with the original intent of this Section 3 before. So I'm voting no. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Peterson on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And so when the amendment was up there on the board a minute ago, it said the following conditions shall be placed on the license 90 days after issuance. And that really wasn't the amendment that we passed. Is that sort of where my amendment went in? Because I wanted to take the first quarterly update to take place 90 days after the business opens. because 90 days after issuance, it might take them a while to get open for business after the license is issued. So I've sort of I'm kind of wondering.
I believe the clerk understands your intent. I'm not sure where the motion ended up.
Through the chair, I'm not positive it's on the board, but we do have it recorded here. It says to say the first quarterly update will be 90 days after the business opens. That's the amendment that we recorded and that you voted on.
Right, okay.
And that will be amending Ms. LaFrance's amendment.
Right, I just didn't exactly see it, so, okay, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Weddleton on the amendment.
No, I think I'm sorry, I'd withdraw.
Ms. Zalatel on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to speak to Mr. Dyson's point. I have a differing viewpoint, and this is why. I think we have created a series of checks here because we also have some code that already allows for summary suspension of a license to protect health, safety, or welfare. It's already built into the code. What we have here are mechanisms to check in on an operator that we or that some have concerns about in a way that we can take action if we need to, that doesn't also do something to harm the operations potentially without checking in first to make sure we fully understand the situation. I think for that to occur, I would want to rely on the code that we have, which allows the municipal clerk to find, in their expertise in dealing with these licenses, a public health, safety, or welfare violation that's an immediate threat. So I think the combination of the two actually does what Ms. LaFrance is intended to do and what you're looking for. So I would encourage supporting the amendment because I think it just adds that last piece to the package of what we're trying to do here.
Thank you. Seeing no further discussion, members may proceed to vote on the amendment. That amendment passes 8-1. We now have the main motion before us. Any further discussion? Mr. Constant.
Thank you. This process has been very interesting and still uncertain as to how it comes out with especially a 9-member board. However, I will say many good things have come from this process at the Downtown Community Council meeting. As I mentioned at the committee, I would like to mention here on the record, they had a really warm kind of December Christmas celebration, and at the time they had an election. They elected a new president, Sylvia Villamides, and they also elected a new at-large member, Mr. Richard Irwin, who is on the board of the Hope Center. And these processes, although they can be quite contentious at times, can also provide great fruit. And the fruit of this work is that through really strong leadership of Ms. Villamides in this conversation over many months and meetings, there has been an improvement in the community already because of this process. And that improvement shall, in my opinion, last for a long time, despite what happens in the next 10 minutes. Thank you. I urge your support.
Thank you. Mr. Weddleton.
Thanks. I will support this, but I'm nervous, and I stated before, I'm nervous about this applicant. I think they have not shown to be, that they run their businesses very crisply, and we expect that for marijuana businesses. I mean, it's very high stakes, not just for them, but goof ups by one, tarnish the entire industry. It's a danger to the public. And I think we have a kind of a good body of evidence showing that, but is it enough to deny a license? And I'm not quite ready to go there, because we don't really have criteria saying where is that threshold. It's still very vague. And that's something that I hope that we'll clarify in the next few months as we start looking on this. And I certainly hope the applicant does a great job, and I hope it's a booming business and you do great. And I will go forward expecting that, but I'm still nervous. So thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I just wanted to point out that the violations, the vast majority of them have come from the cultivation facility, not the retail facility that they currently operate. And I'm expecting that this will be an excellent operation. Before we voted to shut them down for a couple weeks last year, they were one of the top retailers in town based on how much taxes they were submitting to the municipality on a regular basis. And so in retail business, typically sales are something that is measured to tell whether a person is a good operator or is running a good business. And so I fully expect that things were going to go well with this retail operation, and I'm hoping that some of the problems that they've had in their cultivation facility will have been solved and will not have future violations. So I'll be a yes vote on this. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have serious reservations about granting this license. And I'm nervous too, as Mr. Weddleton said. However, given the amendments that we passed and worked on together as a body, given the MOU that has been incorporated into it, and the staff's recommendation to issue the permit, I will support it. That said, I will also support the clerk moving forward, should it come to that, where there are violations and issues, because we are putting a lot of faith and trust in you if this passes. And if there are any problems, I will definitely not hesitate to vote to revoke, or whatever the language, summarily move forward with that, suspend. Thank you. With that process. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the body for the last 2 hours of talking through and working through this process. I think that the CEDC committee, thank you, Mr. Chair, does a really good job of reviewing the licenses and those reports. So thank you.
Thank you. Seeing no further discussion, members may proceed to vote. That item passes 7-2. Mr. Constant?
Mr. Chair, it's, with some regret, I can't stick around for the closing of our business. I have to go to another meeting.
Thank you. You are excused. Moving on in our agenda, we have audience participation. Would anyone like to speak before us? Welcome.
My name is Eugene Callahan. I represent myself. I live in the Massachusetts Valley. I follow the public process. When the public process is done appropriately, decision made by the governing body is more like a public interest. In July, I addressed concern that the school board was going to start meeting on Tuesday nights. That was in July and will start in August. Months have gone by. I bring the issue up. There was a joint meeting of the school board and the assembly at 10 o'clock in the morning last Friday. On the item was this issue. The result was the assembly school board said didn't want to change it. Basically, nothing's being done about it. That means next Tuesday night will be the fourth meeting in a row of the regular meetings of the school board happening the same night as the Anchorage Assembly. Now, last night there was a town hall meeting. I raised concern before it happened the previous week, and that is more of a sell job. A town hall meeting is where the host brings the situation is where the public is speaking for the host and not selling a program, and that's what selected people were selected for a panel. I'm not saying they were good or bad, but a town hall meeting is hearing from the people. But what was the subject? The subject was dealing with the bonds. And look at those bonds. How can the community have a conversation when the same night earlier, the school board was dealing with the bonds, the assembly was dealing with the budget? The public was divided, and the public continues to be divided in attending the school board meetings and assembly meetings. And at the next meeting will be the school board and assembly meetings having the same night, and you're going to be dealing with the bond issue, whether or not to put it on the ballot. The fact is, how can the public choose to come to you or come to the school board? With all due respect, that was not fair. And then in closing, I got enough time to say this, the agenda for this meeting, I kept close tabs and monitored. Yes, there was a notice previously last week or earlier that there would be a meeting today at 5 o'clock. There's no question. But the full agenda was not published on the website until yesterday, sometime between 1:30 and 1:05, because I was taking photographs every time. I kept on looking frequently, and it was sometime that's when the announcement went out. The public should not be blind about this now. And you having 5 o'clock meetings, special meetings on such an issue, in all fairness, most people in Anchorage are just getting out of work. So with all due respect, it's business as usual, and I'm still waiting for a request that I have not heard from, that concerning for persons to be heard.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to speak?
Mr. Chairman, members of the Assembly, my name is Tom McGrath, and I just want to say that I'm extremely disappointed in the actions you took tonight. The discussions in this community of putting a bar, and now, I guess because of that, a liquor or a marijuana license next to certain types of operations such as a school or a church, those discussions go back 40 years or over 40 years. And the community has fought long and hard to make sure that we protect certain people. And to allow a marijuana license or a bar within a couple of 100 feet of a church is just wrong. And I hope that I'm not going to come up here a couple of years from now and say I told you so. But I think I'll probably do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to speak? Seeing no one, Ms. Quinn Davidson?
Mr. Chair, I just wanted to request that we have Ms. Pearson remind us, now that we've made a decision about the quasi-judicial nature and what the requirements are for us. I know that we might get inquiries from the media, for instance, and I just want to be clear on those requirements.
Sure. Ms. Quinn Pearson?
Yes, Mr. Chair, just to reiterate what I said at the beginning of the meeting, pursuant to Title III of Municipal Code, when this body sits in its quasi-judicial capacity, the restriction on ex parte contact continues for the duration of the period of a possible reconsideration request of the opinion. That's 15 days after the date of the decision. So keep that in mind. Again, ex parte contact includes contact with the media, contact with constituents. As we've discussed previously, you're free to say thank you for your feedback or thank you for your questions. I'm declining to comment because I'm still subject to the ex parte contact restriction imposed by municipal code for this type of decision or some kind of response like that, as opposed to just not responding if someone asks for comment or to discuss. But that restriction does remain in place for the next 15 days.
Thank you. Mr. Weddleton?
So if someone says, what was the result? Do we not supposed to talk?
I think that's a fine line. I personally, I think in that instance you could say the license was approved, and if they say, tell me what you were thinking about that, then I think you would say I'm prevented from providing further comment on this pursuant to the ex parte restriction in code for the next 15 days.
All right, thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and quickly do assembly comments, see if anyone wants to say anything. Mr. Weddleton?
You know, I do, hopefully brief. This has been an interesting process, but, you know, we had a case where, you know, the applicant was told numerous times that there was no protected use there, you can go ahead with it. And then through the public comments and a good public process that we have, information came to light that said, well, maybe there is an issue here. They found that they're having regular religious services, and there was a determination that it is a protected use. And I believe it had to be a really difficult decision to say that when it turned everything on its head at the last minute. And then for the planning department, as we go through further, to look at it again and more closely, I think very carefully, change again and say, well, actually, it's even different than we looked at. I guess I want to thank them for that, and I respect that. I mean, sure, they made a couple mistakes, but they kept plugging away at it in a very honest way until we got where we are now, which I think, that determination, quite what I was looking for, but I think it's probably right. And it's just hard to say I was wrong, to do it twice, and to change your position. So I wish Michelle or whoever had written this was here, because they're that team. I'm impressed that they would do that. Just keep working it no matter what grief it brings them. So, trying to get to the right decision.
Thank you. Ms. Alatel.
No comment, thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to mention that the Community and Economic Development Committee meeting is Thursday at 9 a.m. And I actually don't know what's on the agenda off the top of my head, but we will have one.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Right. It'll be very familiar to you. Ms. LaFrance.
No comments, thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm hoping to see everyone Friday at this hour-and-a-half social that's been planned over at 49th State Brewing Company. I've never been to that place, and so I'm looking forward to checking it out.
It's a great location. I'm sure Mr. Constant would have plenty positive things to say if he were here. Ms. Quinn Davidson.
I just want to echo what Mr. Weddleton said. I think that there was a lot of work that went into this, and I just appreciate it and appreciate my colleagues. If Mr. Dyson were here, he'd probably say he's impressed with how this went down and all the work that was done, and just think that you guys are a really impressive, thoughtful bunch, so it's really nice to work with you. And I want to apologize that I'm going to miss the party on Friday. I think it was partly me and probably others who were pushing to have a party, and then I'm going to miss it after all. So that's really lame, and I'm sorry to do that, but I'm going to be out of town.
Thank you. I also want to applaud all of the work that staff did on this specific case, and it was really impressive. So thank you so much. To the body, we have committee meetings and a work session on Thursday. Then we have 2 or 3 meetings on Friday, including the social. And that is it for the remainder of the year, except for all you lucky people on ethics and elections. Yes, Ms. LaFrance.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So a belated comment that the Enterprise and Utility Oversight Committee meets on Thursday at noon, and there'll be one item on the agenda, and that's a wrap-up of the value engineering discussion on the PCT, and then what comes next.
Thank you. With that, I will entertain a motion to adjourn. We're adjourned.